Can this medieval city survive the Industrial Revolution? After 500 years of history, our medieval city is about to face its biggest test yet. The Industrial Revolution has arrived, bringing steam engines, factories, and rapid urban growth. Can centuries of urban planning adapt to this new industrial age? Let's find out. If you're new to this series, this is my third video in this save. We started in the medieval era, building a hilltop castle town. Then fast forwarded 300 years into the Renaissance, creating a bustling port city, complete with canals and grand plazas. Now we're jumping ahead another century, right into the heart of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 18th century, then spread across Europe and America. Steam-powered factories dominated the skyline, as textiles, consumer goods and machines flooded the markets. Canals, and later railways, cut through cities, linking resources to ports and factories. The lesser-known agricultural revolution also transformed society, as farming became more efficient, forcing workers to seek employment in the cities. Subsequently, market towns became industrial centres, packed with factory districts, rows of worker housing and new transport hubs. Populations exploded, but pollution and overcrowding followed. Now that we've shifted time periods, the rules of this challenge have evolved too. So far, we've only placed historically plausible buildings and infrastructure, which will be the same today, but the no cars rule is loosening somewhat, since the very first cars appeared in this era. That being said, I'm not about to start dropping 12-lane highways like some kind of American. The focus stays on railways, trams, and walkable neighbourhoods. The final thorn in our side is money. We don't have much of it left. We've spunked through 20 million of the 33 million we started with, and the city still isn't really profitable. On top of that, I need to roughly double our population to stay historically accurate, so everything we've built so far is about to get seriously urbanised. And as for new builds, let's just say that the to-do list is long, with a few of your suggestions mixed in, and if you've got more suggestions, let me know in the comments. This chapter starts a little differently from the last videos. Previously, I kept the game paused for most of the episode, then unpaused at the end for the live section of the video. But this time, I had to unpause straight away to stabilise the city. Last time, our budget was swinging wildly between profit and loss. Turns out that was because of the motels I'd placed. They'd make a huge tax income initially when they were full, and then collapse when they ran out of customers. So the whole economy was bouncing up and down. Big thanks once again to Twyla from my Discord, who instantly spotted the problem and explained it to me. She definitely understands the game better than I do. So the first thing I did was delete the Emerald building which I placed down here in Newport, and that definitely seemed to help. I've also made some changes to the mod list since last time. First, I added the static ploppables and the modular zoning blocks mods. A lot of people recommended this, but shout out to Kitty Cat Aspen, who suggested it all the way back in episode 1. Second, I removed the infinite demand mod. It was useful for kickstarting the city, but I suspected now that it was screwing with our population balance. Last video, we were seeing wild swings of plus or minus 5,000 people at a time. So with the mod list updated, I unpaused and let the demand settle. Where we left off last time, unemployment was around 50%, which is not great. That's where these modular zoning blocks came in. They let me clip commercial or office space inside existing buildings, and the game still treats them like normal zoned lots. For example, in the castle, I added commercial blocks to the merchant square to make it feel a bit more alive. In the town hall, I added some office space because this building wasn't really being used. Then down in Stone Key, I hid industrial zoning blocks inside the waterfront warehouses, since the pollution here would just blow straight out to sea. I also reworked this stone quarry a bit. In vanilla Cities Skylines 2, stone quarries are just a grey texture that you draw on the ground, which I still think is a bit of a missed opportunity. So I dug into the terrain to make it look like it had been excavated, then placed our first industrial signature building, the Ground Earth building, which boosts ore production and buffs industrial buildings too. I also squeezed in this Eastern Europe shopping centre as well. It looked convincing as some kind of aggregate processing plant. Then I filled out the rest of the area with warehouses and other industrial ploppables to complete the look. Finally, I spammed out a lot more hidden commercial zoning around the city, mostly inside these Mediterranean residential down here in Newport, where there was the most unemployment already. And it worked! Unemployment dropped from 50% down to 25%. Population started climbing again, and for the first time in a while, the budget stayed in the green. With the city stabilised, it's about time we introduce some new infrastructure into this old town. There was so much to do in this video that I wasn't sure where to start. But instead of running around upgrading every corner of the city straight away, I decided to begin with the railway. As railways were a bit of a game changer back in the day, industry and residential would often pop up around the train lines. So I thought if I lay down the rails first, I'd have something to expand around naturally, and I'll come back to updating the old city later, I promise. I started by building a raised railway line coming in from outside the map, running parallel with the King's Road. I elevated it quite high, keeping it as flat as possible, because Victorian trains weren't exactly professional hill climbers. They weren't like Jonas Vingegaard on a mountain stage, they were more like Stephen Hawking. For these rail embankments, I used the landfill texture because I thought it looked like loose rock or slag.
I didn't become a little bit of a slag. I became a total slag.
Which makes sense, because rail embankments in this century were often reinforced with gravel, cinders, or even slag from nearby industries, both to stabilise the track and reuse industrial waste. To help blend it into the landscape, I surrounded the embankment with coniferous trees. I'm not sure if that's strictly historical, but conifers were a common sight along railways. They're fast growing, hardy, and often planted deliberately as windbreaks, so it didn't feel too out of place. To cross the river, I built a double truss arch bridge. By the mid-1800s, engineering had advanced to the point where both iron arch bridges and early suspension bridges were being built. The famous Britannia Bridge in Wales and Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol are good examples of this era. Next came the historic Central Station asset, which is a bit of a no-brainer for this time period. I thought about connecting the whole city up with a rail network, but ended up keeping it simple with just one station on flat ground linking us to the outside world. There's no way that a train could get up Castle Hill anyway. Well, in game they could, but not in my imagination. Instead, I'd planned to handle local transit using a different kind of rail. Our station sits right at the top of this main road that runs all the way down into Newport's main plaza. And this road felt like the perfect spot for a tram line. Since the area was inspired by Lisbon, it made even more sense, because Lisbon is famous for its yellow trams, which first appeared in the late 1800s. So, much like a real Victorian, I bulldozed dozens of homes without hesitation in the name of progress, clearing out a space for a tram depot. Then finished off with the tram lines running down this main road, around the plaza and back again. Whilst I was in Newport, I also placed an asset that I've been itching to use, the German department store. I think it's modelled after a real factory that had been converted into a shopping centre, but still looks just like a factory. I put it right next to the tram depot, right on the waterfront, and even gave it its own little canal for easier loading and unloading of goods. Then filled in the leftover space with industrial props and surfaces to complete the look. My next task was to continue the railway down the coast, partly to find space for the rail yard, so we could actually have some trains on these rails. The rail yard is a lot bigger than the tram depot, so it needed a bit of open flat space. I bridged over this gravel road and across this big open field, and this seemed like a good a place as any after I'd smoothed out the terrain. I connected it up with a pedestrian path and tidied up these trees, which revealed a family of 4 deer hanging out. Well, I hope they're not family, because they appear to be performing some kind of mating ritual. I reckon they do it in deery style. Anyway, the final job was connecting up the rail yard and extending the railway across this second river with another bridge. And with all this infrastructure in place, it's definitely got me in the mood for some more industry. Maybe it's time Skylinburg got its first dedicated factory district. To complement the rail yard, I decided that this whole stretch of land between the rail and the sea was going to be our first factory district. Transport access by both land and water made it the perfect site. I wanted to start with something big, something that would loom over the whole area, and the paper factory was perfect for this. Paper manufacturing was booming in the 19th century, especially with the rise of newspapers, printed books, and packaging, so it's a believable industry for this stage of industrialisation. Historically, factories often appeared in places with easy access to raw resources, power and transport, specifically coal fields, rivers for shipping, and later rail lines. And wherever factories went, housing districts often sprung up around them. In the UK especially, industrialists built endless rows of terraced housing for their workers. You can still see them today in cities like Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham. Whole cities were shaped by rows of brick terraces. To replicate that, I used the UK terraced houses with alley roads to build our first worker district. I deliberately gave it only one access road, right next to the factory. Real factory owners weren't exactly concerned with quality of life. These districts were built to be cheap and efficient, not convenient. On the other side of the road, I wanted another, smaller factory, and I settled on the Chinese shopping mall asset, which does look a bit modern, but when recoloured, it passed well enough as an industrial building. And of course, I gave it its own set of terrace houses for the workers. I tucked in some more hidden jobs with the modular zoning blocks, and tree-tailed along the railway to blend everything in. Next idea I had was to connect this district to the other side of the railway, near this deep river, which would almost certainly be used for shipping and logistics. I ran the pedestrian path up to the railway, then carved out a little gorge underneath the rail line for people to pass through. But before expanding any further, I had a few chores to do. So I set up the train line so new workers could actually move in, and then I added some garbage management for the first time. This one was Japan flavoured, and also our first park maintenance depot. For the waterfront section, I boarded it with a pedestrian key, then dropped in two industrial signature buildings, the dairy house and the farmer factory. Both were about the right size and look that I wanted, and I knew that they would create a lot of employment. I filled in the gaps with props and surface detail to complete the zone. Back on the main road, and I wasn't about to waste this leftover space near the rail line, I crammed in a crematorium and filled the rest with these UK medium buildings. Down on the waterfront, I'd left just enough room for another batch of terraces, which were just as fiddly as ever to line up. And these industrial signature buildings were a great place to hide even more industrial zoning blocks, since the pollution here would mostly blow out to sea. But honestly, I wasn't too fussed about polluting the locals anyway. Workers at this time had no concept of smog, lung disease or industrial deafness. Health and safety was basically, don't get caught up in the gears. Finally, I placed a cargo terminal on the waterfront, and I've got a feeling this is going to be one of the busiest pieces of infrastructure in the city. The last space to fill was right behind the paper factory, and you're never going to believe what I put here. More terraces. I tree-tailed the edges, tucked in some more industrial blocks, and the factory district was complete. The final task in this chapter was heading back to Newton and upgrading the area around the central station into something more worthy of the 19th century. But first, the tram line, which has been running for a while now, and the station tram stop was completely swamped. It looks like these pedestrians are huddling together for warmth like some kind of penguin.
Penguins.
So, progress demands sacrifices. I bulldozed the old houses around the station and replaced them with these higher density medium residential. It kept the same look as Newport, just expanded as if demand for housing had grown over time. For variety, I added some German medium residential and then set aside space for some more grand civic buildings. Things like the Eastern Europe City Hall and the French signature buildings made the station area feel like a new, prestigious district. I continued with these French assets, even squeezing in some French low-rent housing, which works as either compact factories or additional housing or even commercial. Once again, the finishing touches were surfaces and trees, but honestly, I'd got quite fatigued of hand-placing buildings for so long. I don't know why building in this area I find so tiring, but it means I was eager to leave this for now and move on to building something cooler. The start of this chapter also coincided with the first snowfall that we've seen in this city. You might have noticed that some of the trees are brown and the whole place looks quite desaturated. That's because we are in the middle of winter here in Skylinburg, and when it gets cold enough, the snow will cover the whole city, and I'm quite excited to see how it'll look. You might also notice these power bottleneck icons on the King's Road, and that's because our total power consumption has exceeded the carrying capacity of this cable. So I thought it was a good time to start our first power generation in the city. After all, steam power is now canon. To get started, I put down a grand bridge next to the railway bridge, and I'm sure I recognise these assets from somewhere. This bridge would be an extension of the King's Road, which continued down the coast, and also made a convenient way of connecting up the factory district. My plan for this area involved a couple of small coal power plants. I know that they're less efficient than the normal coal power plants, but the cooling towers on them just didn't fit in. I placed them at slightly different heights to account for the slope of the river, and in my head, I'd imagine these power stations were being supplied with coal from the mines up in the mountains. If only there was some way that this area could conveniently access these other rivers by boat. That's right, we are building a canal. I bet you never expected that. I hadn't planned these originally, but I was trying to think like a Victorian and naturally came up with a Victorian solution. I knew that building a canal in-game was going to be tricky. Cities Skylines is notorious for its janky water physics, often resulting in accidental tsunamis. This would be particularly difficult because it wasn't completely flat the whole way. The canal would have to vary its elevation. In real life, the solution was to use locks, which is basically a gated chamber filled with water and works similarly to the dry docks we built last video. A boat would enter at one water level, the gates close behind it, water is then let in or drained until the chamber's water level matches the other canal, and then the opposite gate opens, allowing the boat to continue its journey. Using this method, you could theoretically keep raising your canal's height indefinitely, like the Cane locks in Wiltshire, that have 16 locks back to back and increase the water level by 72 meters. Unfortunately, we're not able to create an actual real usable canal, although that would be awesome to have in game. Please devs? Until then, we're going to have to make do and pretend. To get started, I created the sides of the canal with pedestrian paths and added quaysides on the inside. I'm fairly sure that the quaysides don't actually block any water. Water only seems to interact with the terrain. So my plan was to leave a ridge of earth inside the gates to stop water flowing out of it. And this created our first lock of the canal, and it would offer easy access upstream into the mountains, but also downstream to Newport as well. A heavy snow rolled in around now, so apologies if it's harder to see what I'm doing, but to summarise, I continued digging out the canal, adding in locks for about every 10 meters change in height, and making sure that each section of the canal was separated by earth, not just roads. Now it was time to start adding in some water, and for this I'll be using the water features mod, which has caused many tsunamis in my cities so far. It allows you to set the intended height of the water level, and then add in water wherever you want. These work just like water source blocks from Minecraft, but they're a lot harder to undo. For example, I added in water to the whole canal, making sure it was at the right height, and then took a quick break to fly around and admire Skylenberg in the snow. And before I knew it, the water was overflowing its banks and creating a mini lake in this field. It wasn't too hard to fix. I used Move It to raise up the banks of the canal, but once the water gets somewhere, it stays there unless you fill it in. I took it as inspiration because the area it had filled was quite a cool shape. So this area shall forever be known as Canal Lake. What I wasn't happy about though is Train Station Lake, which had spilled over down here. But Poseidon had spoken, so we ought to find some canonical reason that this lake exists. Maybe this water is used to top up the steam engines, ready to be turned into steam. Moving back to the power station, and it seems like the water had moved down here too. Maybe the Minecraft water source blocks don't work how I thought they did. So I'm going to delete them while I deal with the fallout. Such as this new lake here. These flooded factories. Can't forget about this new lake as well. And even a flooded roundabout. After a lot of tinkering, the water levels had stabilised and I'd got rid of most of the lakes. Now, the canal was looking pretty good if I say so myself. It should also act as a normal road too, at least for pedestrians. Real life canal boats in this time were often pulled along by a donkey, so the sides of the canal had well trodden paths for the donkeys to walk on. I can't wait for the donkey DLC to finally drop.
Donkey?
Now that the snow had retreated and the great floods were dealt with, I was keen to keep adding to this area, starting with an extended waterfront, a hidden footpath, and a new bridge over the canal, giving us easier access to the rest of this area. Next to the power plants, I added in some more power infrastructure and also a new water pump, which I'm kind of using to look like a pier. In this space next to the canal, this would most likely be used for loading and unloading. So I covered it with a rough cobblestone texture and decorated with some warehouses and stockpiles, and of course some boats. Whilst I was up this way, it gave me a chance to detail these new lakes that were non-consensually forced upon us. I added a park next to the Choo Choo Lake, and then the trusty Old Mill ruins out here in the middle of this lake. The final touches for this power station were some piles of coal, a spot of recolouring, and fixing some wonky roads. And then my priorities shifted from industrial to residential, because of course these power plants were going to need some workers. Nothing groundbreaking occurred during this. I built 2 sets of terraced houses using the UK assets and the alley roads. Thankfully though, these UK assets are technically medium density residential, but they satisfy the low density residential, which I'd really struggled to satisfy so far. Sounds like me in bed. With 2 sets of terraces down, I wanted to add some more factories and industrial buildings near the waterfront. These EU commercial buildings work quite well when spliced into each other, turning them into one big mega factory. I used these with a mixture of other industrial buildings and stockpile zones, who no doubt would be making the use of this waterfront. The final thing I placed over here was a small train station. I know I said we would only have 1 train station, but this felt like not only an easy addition for the Victorians to add, but also quite a believable one as well. There was now quite a lot of population density in this area, meaning there was a lot more people for the rail operators to service and charge, justifying the building of a new train station. I connected it up with a pedestrian bridge over the road, and now it was time to continue the Industrial Revolution elsewhere. Before we get started on this chapter, I just wanted to say a big thank you to you guys for your support on this series. You guys have been great. Engagement is what encourages me to keep going, so if you want to see more, it's as easy as leaving a like.
I'll stop
editing
when you stop
liking the videos.
Whilst I'm at it though, it looks like about 94% of viewers aren't actually subscribed, which is fine. I'm fine. I'm not upset. If you do subscribe though, I'm giving away a month's subscription to my Only Trams page. So if you want to watch me get railed, then you know what to do. What am I doing with my life? Stupid jokes aside, let's talk about my plans for this area right in the middle of everything. I have a few considerations for this part of the build. This area was surrounded by just about everything we've built already. After a lot of thinking, I decided to focus around this main road that connects up Newport to the rest of the map. Buildings in this area would have easy access to pretty much all the areas we've built so far, and would have a lot of footfall passing through. Therefore, I wanted to fill this area with some relatively nice residential buildings, and maybe some big warehouses and shops on the road. Starting near the cliffside, I built a long pedestrian path that connects up Rockhaven to the factory district, and gave it some side roads as well. For the buildings, I used more of these French buildings, but not necessarily as French buildings. In my head, I was thinking of the white, neoclassical buildings that were built in London at this time. I researched this for another video and ended up cutting it, but stone that was mined way over here in Portland was used to build some of London's most famous monuments, including the Tower of London, St Paul's Cathedral, Somerset House, Bank of England, British Museum, Nelson's Column, National Gallery, Admiralty Arch, Buckingham Palace, the Old Bailey, the Cenotaph, Clarence House, and the BBC Broadcasting House. I know these white buildings do stick out a bit, but I was thinking of a posh city centre and couldn't get London's West End out of my head, so I'm just going to go with it. I did use some of these red-roofed French buildings to try and blend it in with the rest of the city, and also some Eastern Europe buildings that we'd used over in Rockhaven. For the main road, I definitely wanted some kind of warehouse. This would be a perfect spot for something like a customs house or a market hall due to its proximity to the port and the rest of the city. Once again, the EU commercial buildings worked well when spliced together, and I even managed to sneak in a police station down here as well. The last thing I added was a park in the middle and another row of white buildings, and this side of the road was done. However, my plans for the other side of the road were quite different. I was inspired by a commenter on the last video, Doofusdan. Doofasdan? Doofasdan? Doofasda N? Who suggested I build a manor house, which I think is a cool idea. I want this area to be like a royal retreat, if there was still a monarchy in these parts. Even if there wasn't, I wanted to mix this in with an idea of my own. Yeah, that's right, I can have ideas of my own. Well, technically, it's the idea of the Victorians of London, who were great at creating parks in urban areas, as somewhere for people to escape the smog and disease. These parks were typically once a private estate surrounding a manor house, but the land was reclaimed by the people, either with money or with legislation. The first thing I thought people would want was a football pitch.
Constant, dizzying, 24-hour, year-long, endless football, every kick in it massively mattering to someone, presumably.
Which was invented in the second half of this century. I also added a sports pavilion next to the pitch, then it was time to get the manor house down. The French City Hall was just the right size for this, once I'd added the extension wings to either side, and I finished off with some smaller signature building props, to act as maybe a groundskeeper's house or a servant's quarters. For the surrounding lands, I split it up using tree lines, and wanted to give each field a distinctive feel to it. Starting with the main field, I wanted this to be clean and manicured, so I extended out the mowed grass texture that comes with the manor house. For this lower field near the road, I wanted to make an orchard. Conveniently, we've got apple trees in the game, which felt like a good fit, and I used a riverbed texture over the grass to make it look a bit more rough. In this other big field we've got, I wanted it to be an unkept forest, perhaps used for hunting. So I started with the campsite park, hoping that people would actually use this area, and then added a woodland path running through, and of course the most important ingredient, trees. This area also got a riverbed texture. Whilst I was at it, I also added some trees to the main field and a small park. I used birch trees because they're fancy, and palm trees around the back because they're even fancier. Out on the lawn, I wanted to try my hand at making a hedge maze. I've never made one before, and I think you can probably tell, this wouldn't really be hard to get through. But I was focusing too hard on making sure I wasn't creating any naughty symbols. Anyway, for the final two fields, I turned one into a meadow with trees, and the other one into a ploughed field. Meaning that all I had to do was fill in this undeveloped land, and then I would be finally done with building in this area, maybe forever. I was using a wide range of residential buildings, trying to blend in all the different styles that surround this area. Mainly blending the white neoclassical buildings with the red-roofed Mediterranean buildings. And I think I got away with it. I'm still concerned that the French buildings stand out too much. Let me know what you think. Actually, save your judgment for now, because later I'm going to place a very French monument, and I think it's going to change this city's skyline. 2. All the way back in the age of 20 minutes ago, I said that I would come back to these old areas and give them their 19th century facelift, and that time has finally come. The Victorians were the first generation in Britain to factor in leisure time into their lives. Railways and steamships allowed large numbers of people to travel predictably and affordably. Factory regulations, bank holidays, and more structured work schedules gave workers free blocks of time. And subsequently, fishing villages exploded into seaside resorts, and domestic tourism took off in the UK. All of this is to justify the changes I'm going to make to Stone Quay. My main priority was to just add more density. I wanted to keep the roads following the terrain and having all the houses facing out to sea. Once again, I'm using the Mediterranean buildings, including an elementary and a high school. I also snuck in a clinic and a crematorium down here by the water and decorated with some rock armour and some palm trees. Continuing down the coast, and we're getting close to the failed Napoleonic fort I built last time. And rather than try and improve it, I'm taking inspiration from Nashjan wage makers, who told me to just destroy it, plot residences, and name the area Napoleon. It's a great idea, however I'm not sure that the Victorians would name something after Napoleon, least of all in this century. So instead, I'm going to name it Wellington Terraces, after the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. Maybe I'll shorten it to Welly Terraces so it's easier to say. To access the terraces easier, I built a very janky path going up the cliff, and for the terraces itself, I used the German residentials to give it more of a distinctive look. I ended up replacing them so that the ones in front were shorter, that way we're not blocking anyone's views. And this is where I'm going to leave Welly Terraces for the moment though, because we've still got a lot to do in Stone Quay. and I'll come back to this area in the next video. The rest of Stone Key involves a lot of hand placing buildings, stopping for the occasional park and to place trees. Once again, I was placing the taller buildings on the uphill and the shorter buildings on the downhills. This was all quite samey, so I won't go into too much detail. It's just houses, grass and trees. The quayside did get an upgrade though. I replaced the small houses we placed before with some bigger, more industrial warehouse buildings. The pier also got an extension too, curling round to protect the quay from the waves. And the French water tower once again came in very handy, acting as a lighthouse on the end of the pier. The final touch was a marina inside the harbour walls, perhaps serving fishermen or leisure boats, and that was the last change I made to Stone Key. Now onto Plough End, and after taking a break, I made a change to my playset because I had something very special in mind for this area. Admittedly, something I should have placed in the Renaissance or even earlier, but I didn't know was possible until now. That's because I bought the Cities Skylines 2 pre-order bonus bundle. Turns out people still sell keys for just the pre-order bonus, and it only cost me £5. And it adds loads of really unique landmarks to the game, and I can't believe I haven't seen this till now. First thing I saw was the Botanical Gardens, a huge greenhouse that displayed plant life from all over the world, and it only cost me about a quarter of my remaining money. But I think it was worth it. It adds tourism and recreation to this area, and this is the exact kind of thing that Victorians love doing. They loved collecting other people's stuff and showing them off in a museum. I added back in the path and ended up changing some of these grass textures into something more vibrant, and I think I'm pretty happy with how this area looks now. This bonus pack also adds the Notre Dame Cathedral. Many European cities have cathedrals, some more grand than others. They were often built on elevated positions or in central squares, making them a dominant feature of the skyline, and signalling religious and civic authority. They were usually built in established towns and cities, and typically had easy access to main roads. Therefore, what better place than Plough End, up here on the hill, next to this main road. Sadly though, the big greenhouse has put us under the 5.6 million we need to place this. So I unpaused for a bit and flew around. The only change I made was to this covered bridge we placed way back at the start of episode 1, and I upgraded it into an arch bridge instead. With 6.1 mil in the bank, now I need to find somewhere to put this massive cathedral. The real-life Notre Dame finished construction in 1345, so we are way off time-wise. But like I said, I didn't know this was in the game, so please just try and imagine this was here the whole time. Actually, what am I talking about? The Notre Dame only opened last year in December 2024. Why did it take them so long? Anyway, for the surrounding area, I wanted to continue the white limestone look of the cathedral using these French assets. So I bulldozed all the old buildings, but kept the road layout pretty much the same. And for the next 20 minutes proceeded to go hog wild with these French buildings, until this area had a notable aroma of cheese and cigarettes. Around the fringes though, I tried to incorporate some of these other styles of building, until Plough End looked suitably blended in. Down in Lower Plough now, and this jaggedy wheat field got turned into more residential, except down here I'm using these smaller Eastern Europe assets to gradually decrease the density, and with a handful more neighbourhoods in down the bottom of the hill, my work here was done. We can finally progress into the final chapter, which I think is going to be a bit of a quickfire round. There's been a few comments suggesting I make use of this island on the other side of the bay, and I like that idea. Something that I felt was underrepresented so far was the military, and how that would have an impact on land use in this time. The Industrial Revolution brought with it ironclad, steam-powered navies, whose cannon fire could accurately reach anywhere in the city. So the first thing I want to build over here is a star fort, and shout out to Chris Beer for that suggestion. Having a star fort in mind, naturally the first shape I made was a star, but I think it looked a bit silly, so that had to go. The next shape I tried was a pentagon, which worked much better once I'd stuck some nubbins on the end. For the inside of the fort, I dug out a smaller pentagon, giving us space to work with inside, which I decorated with a barracks, a police HQ, a church, and of course some trees. On top of the fort, I decorated with roads and used retaining walls on them for a bit more definition. I couldn't have any large buildings up here because they could get shot by artillery, so I used a bunch of smaller prop buildings, then hid residential zoning blocks inside them. To give road access to this area, I thought about a bridge, but given this would be an active waterway, I thought a tunnel would work better. And tunnels like these were not unheard of during the 1800s. Just the Thames alone in London was successfully tunnelled under at least a few times in this century. With the fort accessible and the boat lines connected, it was time to decorate the rest of this island. Given that this island was used by the military, I thought that some large industrial warehouses would work well over here. Perhaps this area was used for shipbuilding, or for training, or some other auxiliary purpose. Something I wanted to include on this island was a prison, which I thought made sense given that it was on an island and surrounded by the military. This was inspired by the random farmer's comment, who wanted me to place a mental hospital, and I think there's enough overlap there that we can place a prison instead. The prison is quite large and quite modern, but there's literally only one prison asset in the game, and our city needs a prison, so what do you want me to do? Final touches was of course some trees and some surfaces, and now we're moving on to the next part of the quickfire round, which has been pretty slow so far. Back at the coal power plant, and I thought this place was missing a coal mine. Maybe the power station was built here because there was coal here, and having a power plant here was the reason these factories were built. And with that blended in, a major thing we were missing was some farmland. I do not want to place any more of those zigzag zones because I value my sanity. So instead, I'm going to make some fake farmland using the farm texture and some tree lines. It's worth stating at this point that in real life, all available land surrounding this city would have been used by humans somehow, for farming or forestry or for settlements. Once again, for sanity reasons, I'm not going to decorate the whole map with farmland, so I'm just going to have to ask you to pretend with me on that one. As a consolation prize, I hope that this token area of farmland is enough for your imagination to do the rest. The final building project of this video is by no means a small one, and it ties back into the fort that we've just built. A fort in this location would be great for protecting the area in a 360-degree radius. Most importantly, it would protect the inside of the bay, near the mouth of the river. And for that reason, I thought that some of the most precious naval infrastructure would be built here, such as a dockyard. For this build specifically, I took heavy inspiration from a real-life Royal Navy dockyard that had been in use for about 300 years at this point. Let me know in the comments if you recognise where it is. The dockyard in question has quite an interesting shape, with many inlets and basins and wet docks all along the waterfront. After finishing the waterfront and sorting out the terrain, my next priority was filling out the surrounding area, in which I wanted a mix of large and small buildings, some big warehouses for ship construction, and smaller offices and workshops to support ship maintenance and construction. I also included some large signature buildings, which work quite well as barracks and command headquarters. However, about now, Nvidia notified me that I'd actually filled my 2TB solid state drive with footage, just for this video. So if anyone's got a spare SSD lying around, then hit me up. But after uninstalling some games, I had just enough space to show off the finished build, which I think came out pretty well. I think the In-Caserium office signature building works great where it is. It's the tallest building in the dockyard and works great as a command HQ. I also added some more coal mines up here in the mountains, which I'd imagine would have an easy ride down the river to drop off the coal. And now my friends, the cherry on the cake is putting some names on these districts. Starting with Newton, formerly Newtown, where I tweaked the boundaries so it didn't include the country park. That would instead get its own name, and I went with Newton Park simply because it rolls off the tongue nicely. Further north, and Canal Lake is getting a district too, although it seemed to have dried up somewhat. Nothing a water source block can't fix, and I also took the time to decorate with some foliage and riverbed textures. Next, onto the rows of terraced stone buildings in the middle of the city, which I ended up calling Greyfair. It's a nod to Mayfair in West London, which was the inspiration, except it references the grey stone that I used to build it. Now onto Wellington Terraces, which ended up being quite large, but we still got plenty of room for expansion when we come back to this area. And for the factory district, the name I chose has two meanings. I went with watermark. The water in watermark refers to, obviously, the water, and mark, like the same mark in Denmark, which means border or frontier. Basically, it's a smarty pants way of saying seafront. The other meaning of this name, though, is more of a nod to the paper industry in the heart of this area. We still use watermarks digitally in the modern day, but in this context, they were a design embedded into the paper to mark its origin, authenticity, and quality. Next to Watermark, we have the coal power plants, which I gave a much more literal name. I went with Coal Drop because this area has a lot of navigable waterways, and this is where the boats would come to drop the coal. Further out of the city, we have the fortified island, complete with its own prison. In my head, I was getting Shutter Island vibes from this place, so I shall name it Butter Island, just because it's funny. Last but not least, we have the Royal Navy dockyard, which I'm going to name Gun Wharf. This is another clue of where I base this area on, even though this isn't Gun Wharf specifically in real life. It's just a cool name though, and would refer to a quay or a dockside used for storing and handling naval artillery. And there we have it, another era down. I would love to keep building, but my hard drive is full and...
computer says no.
Next video, we are in the 1900s of course. And I'm undecided if I want to split the century into pre-WW2 and post-WW2, so I'd love to hear your thoughts and any ideas you've got on what to build. But until then, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video, and I'll see you in the next one.